Before we get into video, could everyone please subscribe to my HOA Karen Tales channel? Thank you so much. I never thought purchasing a historic farmhouse in the suburbs would lead to this much drama. When I bought the place 2 years ago, I was thrilled to find a genuine 19th century farmhouse that had somehow survived the suburban sprawl around it. The property came with 3 acres of land, including the original barn, which I'd converted into my home office. Eleanor Jenkins had lived there for nearly 60 years and only sold because she was moving to Florida to be closer to her grandchildren. She'd been meticulous about preserving the historic character of the place. Original hardwood floors, handcrafted banisters, and even the old cast iron stove in the kitchen that I'd carefully restored. What I didn't realize was that my little slice of rural paradise was technically part of the Meadowbrook Estates Homeowners Association, even though my property predated the development by over a century. Enter Karen Wilkins, the HOA president. I still remember our first meeting when she marched up the gravel driveway with a clipboard and a scowl. Her platinum blonde bob swung with each determined step. She wore crisp white capri pants, a pale pink polo shirt with the collar popped, and oversized designer sunglasses perched on her head like a crown. Speaking in a high-pitched nasal voice, she said, "Excuse me, but your fence is 2 inches taller than regulation, and that barn color isn't on our approved palette. I'm going to have to issue a violation notice." I politely explained that my property was grandfathered in with special exemptions due to its historic status, a fact confirmed by the County Historical Society and noted in my deed. Karen didn't take this well. Her perfectly lip-lined mouth twisted in displeasure. "Well, I've never heard of such a thing. I'll need to see documentation immediately. The bylaws clearly state that all properties within Meadowbrook Estates must adhere to our standards, no exceptions." I invited her inside, partly to be hospitable and partly because I wanted a witness to her behavior. My neighbor Tom was helping me install shelving in the kitchen, and I could tell he was trying not to laugh as Karen inspected my home with open disdain. Card room with disapproval? Farmhouse chic is so passé. The board has been encouraging a more modern aesthetic, and these wood floors must be a nightmare to maintain. Our approved flooring vendor has some lovely vinyl options that mimic hardwood. I offered her coffee, which she declined with a grimace, as if I'd offered her motor oil. When I produced the documentation of my exemption status, she snatched the papers from my hand, reading through them with increasingly furrowed brows. I provided the documentation, of course. The look on her face when the HOA lawyer confirmed my exemption status 3 days later was priceless, like she'd bitten into a lemon thinking it was an orange. Her perfectly manicured fingernails tapped an aggressive rhythm on the conference table as the lawyer, a tired-looking man named Mr. Patel, explained that yes, my property was indeed exempt from most aesthetic regulations due to its historical designation. From that moment on, I became Karen's personal project. Every week brought a new complaint. My chickens were livestock in a residential area, my vegetable garden was an unsightly agricultural endeavor, and my restored windmill was an unauthorized structure exceeding height limitations. I maintained my composure through it all, killing her with kindness and meticulously documenting every interaction. When she complained about my hand-painted mailbox, a lovely rendition of the farmhouse that my artist sister had created for me as a housewarming gift, I sent her a polite email with attached photos of other non-standard mailboxes in the neighborhood, including her own monogrammed one. When she issued a violation for the wildflower meadow I planted to attract butterflies and bees, claiming it looked untended, I forwarded her the commendation I'd received from the local environmental conservation group for creating pollinator-friendly habitat. I installed security cameras around my property after the 3rd random HOA inspection that somehow always occurred when I wasn't home. The system sent alerts to my phone whenever someone entered the property, complete with video footage. That's when I caught her for the first time, parking her white Mercedes SUV in my barn driveway while she inspected my property. The footage showed her peering through my windows, testing my door handles, and taking photos of my backyard. She spent nearly 20 minutes wandering around my property, occasionally making notes on her clipboard and speaking into what appeared to be a voice recorder. When confronted with the evidence at the next HOA meeting, she claimed she was just doing her due diligence as HOA president and that homeowners with nothing to hide shouldn't object to thorough inspections. My direct neighbors, the Patels on one side and the Johnsons on the other, were sympathetic to my situation. Mrs. Patel brought me homemade samosas one evening and confided that Karen had waged a 6-month campaign against their garden statue of Ganesha, claiming it was religious symbolism in a shared viewscape. Mr. Johnson, a retired attorney, advised me to keep detailed records of every interaction. Document everything, he said, sipping the lemonade we shared on my front porch while watching fireflies emerge at dusk. She's overstepping her authority, and sooner or later she'll go too far. Things escalated when I decided to host a farmer's market on my property last summer. I had checked the county regulations. It was perfectly legal with the proper permits, which I obtained after filling out countless forms and attending 2 county board meetings. I invited local farmers and artisans to set up booths, and the event was a huge success. The community loved it, and several neighbors thanked me for organizing such a wonderful gathering. Meadowbrook residents purchased fresh produce, handmade crafts, and homemade baked goods, commenting on how nice it was to have such an event within walking distance. Karen, however, was livid. She showed up an hour after the market opened, cutting through the happy crowd like a shark through a school of fish. Karen practically shrieked. This is a clear violation of HOA bylaws regarding commercial activities. I'm issuing an immediate cease and desist. You have 15 minutes to shut this down before I call the authorities. Several customers looked alarmed, including Mrs. Rodriguez, who was selecting tomatoes with her young daughter. I calmly guided Karen away from the vendors and explained again about my property's special status. I showed her the county permits I'd obtained and even pointed out the clause in the HOA bylaws that specifically excluded historically designated properties from restrictions on community enrichment activities. I even invited her to set up a booth for the HOA to promote community engagement and distribute information about upcoming neighborhood events. Her response? She stormed off, face flushed with anger, promising consequences. Those consequences came the following weekend when she parked her SUV directly across my barn entrance, blocking vendors from accessing the setup area. When I asked her to move, she smugly replied, "Oh, I'm conducting an official HOA inspection. This could take hours, maybe even all day. So unfortunate about your little market. Perhaps you should have considered the impact of commercial activity on our residential community before organizing such a disruptive event." I remained calm, though my blood was boiling beneath my composed exterior. I took out my phone, documented her car blocking access to my property, and called a tow truck. "You have 5 minutes to move your vehicle before it's towed at your expense," I informed her. This is clearly targeted harassment, and I've documented all of it. For a moment, uncertainty flickered across her face, but she quickly regained her composure. Karen dismissively said, "You wouldn't dare. Do you know how much influence the HOA has with local businesses? Good luck finding a tow company willing to touch my car." As it turned out, Johnson's Towing didn't particularly care about HOA politics. They arrived promptly, much to Karen's shock. She moved her vehicle just as the tow truck operator was preparing to hook it up, costing me the service fee and delaying the market opening by 2 hours. The vendors were understanding, but I was furious. That evening, I installed a gate at the entrance to my barn area with a clear no trespassing sign. The gate wasn't anything fancy, just a simple farm-style wooden gate with iron hinges that matched the historical aesthetic of the property, but it was sturdy and came with a heavy-duty padlock. Karen responded by filing a complaint with the HOA board that my gate violated architectural standards and created an unwelcoming atmosphere contrary to community values. She included photos taken from multiple angles with annotations pointing out how the rustic aesthetic clashed with the refined character of Meadowbrook Estates. The board, tired of her vendetta, dismissed the complaint after Mr. Patel pointed out that several other properties had similar gates, including board member Mrs. Thompson's Tudor-style home. For a few weeks, things were relatively quiet. I continued hosting the farmers market every other Saturday, which grew increasingly popular. Even some board members became regular attendees, with Mrs. Thompson particularly fond of the honey vendor who set up near the old oak tree. I thought perhaps Karen had finally accepted defeat, especially after the board suggested she focus on more pressing HOA matters during their monthly meeting. I was wrong. Last Friday, I returned home from work. I'm an architectural engineer specializing in historic preservation to find her white Mercedes parked in my barn driveway again, right in front of the no trespassing sign. The security alert had come through while I was in a client meeting, showing her arriving around 2 o'clock in the afternoon, clipboard in hand, conducting another inspection. This was the third time this month, and I'd had enough. I sat in my car for a moment, taking deep breaths and considering my options. I could confront her directly, but our previous confrontations had only seemed to fuel her determination. I could call the police and report her for trespassing, but I doubted they'd consider it a high priority, and she'd likely be gone before they arrived. Then I noticed she had parked far enough inside that my gate could still close behind her vehicle. A plan formed in my mind. I quietly closed and locked the gate, securing it with the heavy-duty padlock I had installed after a previous trespassing incident. The satisfying click of a lock engaging sent a small thrill up my spine. I then went inside, packed a bag, and prepared for my previously planned weekend trip to visit my parents 3 hours away. Before leaving, I placed a clearly visible note on my front door: out of town for the weekend, back Monday afternoon. For emergencies, contact. As I drove away, I watched in my rearview mirror as Karen emerged from my backyard, saw the locked gate, and ran toward me, waving her arms frantically. I kept driving, my phone buzzing with notifications as she alternately rattled the gate and shouted at my security cameras. I had considered leaving the side door of my property unlocked, the one that led through the garden and out to the sidewalk, but decided against it. She had chosen to enter my property through the clearly marked no trespassing area. She could exit the same way once someone came to unlock the gate. My security system sent alerts to my phone all evening, Karen alternately rattling the gate, yelling at my security cameras, and making phone calls. Around 5:30, her husband arrived. A tall man in a golf shirt looked profoundly embarrassed as Karen gesticulated wildly, pointing at the gate and then at my house. I couldn't hear their conversation, but her body language made it clear she was demanding he do something. He examined the padlock, shook his head, and appeared to suggest they call someone. Karen shook her head vehemently, her face reddening as she jabbed a finger toward my security camera. Apparently, she didn't want an audience for whatever solution her husband was proposing. Around 7 p.m., a police cruiser pulled up. Officer Rodriguez, whom I recognized from community events, approached the gate where Karen waited, now looking both furious and vindicated. Through my security app, I listened as Karen tried to convince the officer that I had kidnapped her by locking her in. He saw me on his property and deliberately imprisoned me here. I want him arrested immediately for false imprisonment and reckless endangerment. I could have had a medical emergency. I could have died out here. Her husband stood slightly behind her, looking at his shoes, his discomfort evident even through the grainy security footage. Officer Rodriguez, looking distinctly unimpressed, asked, "Ma'am, did you have permission to be on this property?" Karen's stammering response about HOA authority didn't go over well. The officer pointed to the no trespassing sign and asked if she'd seen it. Karen's face turned a fascinating shade of crimson as she admitted she had. She finished by saying, "But as HOA president, I have the right and responsibility to inspect properties within our jurisdiction. That sign doesn't apply to official HOA business." Officer Rodriguez made some notes in her pad. "Actually, ma'am, it does. HOA regulations don't supersede property laws. If the owner has posted a no trespassing sign, you need explicit permission to enter the property, regardless of your position." Karen's husband stepped forward at this point, placing a restraining hand on Karen's arm as she opened her mouth to argue further. "Officer, this is clearly a misunderstanding. My wife was just doing her job, perhaps a bit too enthusiastically. We'd appreciate it if you could help us resolve this situation without things escalating further." The officer then noticed my note with the emergency contact number and called my lawyer. I couldn't hear their conversation, but I watched as Officer Rodriguez nodded several times, occasionally glancing at Karen with a raised eyebrow. After a brief conversation, the officer turned back to Karen. Ma'am, the property owner's attorney has informed me that you have repeatedly trespassed despite written warnings. He's provided me with documentation of at least 7 previous incidents, including security footage. He's willing to have the gate unlocked right now if you sign a statement acknowledging your trespassing and agreeing to pay for the service call. Wise. The gate will remain locked until the owner returns on Monday, and he'll be pressing charges for trespassing when he returns. Karen exploded. This is outrageous. I am the president of the Meadowbrook Estates HOA. I have every right to inspect properties within our jurisdiction. I will sue him for false imprisonment. I will have the entire board vote to put a lien on his property. Do you have any idea who my husband is? He's the vice president of First National Bank. We play golf with the mayor. This is completely unacceptable. Her husband's face went from embarrassed to mortified. Karen, please let's just resolve this and go home. Turning to the officer, he asked, what would we need to sign exactly? Officer Rodriguez remained impressively calm, explaining that HOA authority doesn't override private property rights or trespassing laws. She produced a form from her patrol car, a standard trespassing acknowledgement that would prevent criminal charges from being filed. Karen refused to sign, crossing her arms and turning her back like a petulant child. I did nothing wrong. I will not admit to trespassing when I was conducting official HOA business. Eventually, after nearly 30 minutes of back and forth, Karen's husband signed the statement, apologized to Officer Rodriguez for the inconvenience, and called a locksmith himself. While they waited for the locksmith to arrive, I could see Karen pacing by the gate, occasionally stopping to glare directly into my security camera. Her husband stood apart from her, typing rapidly on his phone, his expression grim. The locksmith arrived just after 8:30, a cheerful older man who seemed amused by the situation, though he maintained professional composure as he worked on the padlock. I could see Karen lecturing him about something, her finger wagging for emphasis. The locksmith nodded politely without pausing his work. When the gate finally swung open, Karen marched straight to her SUV without a backward glance, while her husband paid the locksmith and thanked Officer Rodriguez. As they drove away separately, Karen in a Mercedes and her husband following in his BMW, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. The message had been sent. My property was not her personal inspection playground. I enjoyed my weekend with my parents, deliberately checking my security feed less frequently as the days passed. There were no further incidents, though I did notice several board members driving slowly past my property on Saturday afternoon. They didn't stop or attempt to enter, just observe from the street before continuing on their way. I wondered what conversations were happening in my absence. I returned home Monday afternoon as planned to find a certified letter in my mailbox. The return address showed it was from the Meadowbrook Estates HOA board. Curious, I opened it immediately while still standing in my driveway. Inside was a formal notification that Karen had been removed as president of the HOA. The HOA, following an emergency board meeting on Sunday evening, apparently found my security footage, which my lawyer had shared with the board at their request, to be the last straw in a long list of complaints against her. The letter included an apology for her behavior and an invitation to attend the next board meeting to discuss how the HOA could better respect my property's historic status. The letter went on to explain that board member Mrs. Thompson had been appointed interim president until formal elections could be held next month. It concluded with a personal note from Mrs. Thompson. Your patience has been remarkable. The farmers market has become a beloved community event, and we should have supported it from the beginning. We hope to rebuild trust and ensure that Meadowbrook Estates respects its unique historic character while maintaining the community standards that make our neighborhood special. As I was reading the letter on my front porch, a car slowed in front of my house. Karen sat in the passenger seat, her husband driving. When she saw me, her jaw dropped open and she frantically rolled down her window. Karen screeched, "This isn't over. I've been president for 7 years. 7 years. They can't just remove me because of some technicality. I built this community. I know what you did, turning the board against me with your lies and your farmers markets and your historic exemptions. I'm consulting with my attorney. You'll be hearing from us very soon. Her husband accelerated quickly, cutting off her rant as they disappeared down the street, leaving me standing there with the letter still in my hand. I smiled, folded the letter, and walked into my house, enjoying the sudden peace and quiet of my historic farmhouse. The afternoon sun streamed through the original stained glass panels beside my front door, casting rainbow patterns across the hardwood floor that Mrs. Jenkins had so lovingly maintained for decades. Outside, birds chirped in the ancient oak tree, and somewhere in the distance, I could hear children laughing. For the first time since moving in, I felt like this house, this unique, historic, wonderful house, was truly my home, free from Karen's looming shadow.